Now, let's talk about Jean Piaget and his 4 stages of development of the thinking process, how thinking develops. Now, before discussing these stages in detail, let's first talk about some of the important concepts which are necessary to understand these stages. Now, Jean Piaget, he recognized that there are 4 necessary components to cognitive development. So, first necessary component which he suggested was biological maturation, and in fact more specifically it is the CNS maturation which he's talking about, classical conditioning. Second component which he suggested was learning experience. So he suggested that by learning also people develop cognitive development takes place, such as through conditioning. Now, even social interaction he suggested was important for cognitive development. Now, let's talk about some of the important concepts which he described. So, before going into the stages, let's talk about these concepts. First concept which he described is schema or scheme. Now, basically, these are building blocks of intelligent behavior, or you can say these are cognitive structures. So, a schema is the structure or organization of actions as they're transferred or generalized by repetition in similar or analogous circumstances. So basically, as the child learns certain things in one environment, the child subsequently replicates those actions in a similar or analogous situation, and subsequently that forms the schema. And these schemas, they add up, and gradually the cognitive development takes place. So this is schema. Now, these not just include skills, but it also includes ideas, knowledge, concept. So schema is an important integral part of cognitive development according to Jean Piaget. Now, schema is a term which he uses. Now, initially these schemas include some of the primitive reflexes a child has, and this term schema is more commonly used to refer the early mental structures. So, again, these early experiences, they help a child to make the world more simple, predictable. Now, gradually over the course of development, he then uses the term operation. So, the term for general schemata resulting from use of higher intelligence, that is known as operations. So, when the schemas become more organized, more structures, more integrated, then we use the term operation. So, these are very similar terms, but in the initial stages we use the term schema, while in the later part of the developmental stages we use the term operation, and this we will again discuss when we come to the stages. Now, the baby's motor behavior comes under voluntary control, and the schemas become more internal or interiorized. So as we discuss these schemas which the child keep on developing, they become more interiorized. That means they become more mental, and the child starts to think like the adult sense of the word. For example, initially, if you in the initial stages of the development, you tell a child apple, the child will not be able to create a mental image. But over the course of time with cognitive development, these things become more interiorized. So then in the later stages, if you tell a child apple without showing the apple, the child in his mind is able to create that image. So that is what is meant by interiorization. Now, how do these schemas change? So, child keeps on developing these schemas. Let's try to understand how these schemas change. Important terms which he suggested, one is assimilation and the other is accommodation. Now, what is assimilation? Now, the external stimuli which the organism receives, that influences the organism. So that is known as assimilation. That means the stimuli is influencing the responding organism, while the organism also has some influence on that external stimuli. So that what he described as accommodation. So accommodation is when the responding organism is influencing the stimuli. Now, so what is assimilation? Assimilation is basically incorporating new stimuli into the existing mental structures. So a child receives an external stimuli and he subsequently incorporates it into the existing schema which he has. And what is accommodation? Now, this occurs during the developmental periods when new data that cannot be fully assimilated into the existing mental structures, yet it cannot be ignored as being foreign. So then what happens? The child adapts to this particular environment through accommodation. And how this takes place? This takes place by what he described as equilibration. Again, equilibration, one should understand, it's a dynamic process between assimilation and accommodation as the child responds to the new environment. Now let's try to understand this process. Suppose So first is assimilation. Now assimilation is basically fitting the world into the existing schema. So the child has some existing schemas. Now what will happen? He will try to fit whatever stimuli he receives into the existing mental schemas which he has. So let's discuss this with the help of an example. Initially the baby suck anything which touches its lip or is put in the mouth. So if the mother's nipple comes near the mouth or touches the lip, the child will suck and it will give nutrition. So the child has in this existing schema. Now anything which is put, suppose you put a finger in the mouth of the child will also suck. So again, although it is not nutritive, but the child will react in a similar manner. So he is reacting in the schema which he already has. So baby is basically applying the schema that is already present with the child and try to fit in the environment into it. So this is assimilation. Now, so this basically is what is equilibrium. So child is in equilibrium, or which is brought by equilibration. And as long as the child is able to deal with the external or new stimuli through these previous mental schema which he has, he's in equilibrium. Now, what if there is new experiences that existing schemas cannot handle? Now, suppose now you are feeding this child with a cup. Now, for feeding in a cup, the child has to learn to suck in a different way than what he was doing when mother's nipple was presented to the child. So what happens, since this new stimulus is not getting fitted into the old schemas which he has, it leads to disequilibrium. So the child basically is pushed into an uncomfortable situation which causes disequilibrium, and to restore this balance now, the child must learn the new schemas. And how this new schemas are learned? These are learned through accommodation. So accommodation is basically changing the existing schemas to fit the world. So subsequently, so that equilibrium can be restored. So then now the child builds up new schemas. And what happens is development of these new schemas, the child will repeat this and subsequently they will be assimilated. So this is how the process of development takes place, and the child keeps on adding newer and newer schemas over the older ones. So basically through this process of equilibration, development proceeds. So this is what Jean Piaget suggested, and based on these premises, he gave some of the important stages of cognitive development. Let's discuss the stages of cognitive development which were described by Jean Piaget. First is a sensory motor period. Second is pre-operation sub-period. Third is concrete operations period. And the fourth is formal operations period. Now, in fact, in the original work, Jean Piaget described three periods, that is sensory motor period, concrete operations period, and formal operations period. And he described one sub-period which is pre-operations sub-period. But some people consider this pre-operation sub-period also as a stage. And in fact, these are subsequently discussed as 4 stages of cognitive development. So Jean Piaget says that each stage is a prerequisite for the following one. So one stage should occur, only then the other stage would occur. Although he suggested that the rate at which they occur may vary in children to children. So one may have a different rate and the other may have different rate. So these are the 4 stages which he described. Now let's talk about these stages one by one. The first stage which we're going to discuss is the sensory motor period, which he described was from birth to 1.5 to around 2 years. Now, as the name suggests, here the infant begins to learn through sensory observation, and they gain control of their motor functions by activity, exploration, and manipulation of the environment. So there is basically interaction with the environment of the child is through the sensory part, for example, seeing, hearing things, and by the motor component, for example, grasping or pulling things. And gradually, this is how the child learns. So this is the sensory motor period. Now, the sensory motor period, again, he described it into 6 stages. So these are the 6 stages which occur in the sensory motor period. So first is the inborn motor and sensory reflexes. Second is primary circular reaction. Third is sensory circular reaction. Fourth is use of familiar means to obtain ends. Ends means goals. Tertiary circular reaction and discovery through active experimentation. And ultimately the 6 stages, insight and object permanence. Again, object permanence is a very important concept in this stage. We'll talk about it. Now, these are the 6 stages which is described under sensory motor period. And again, for our understanding, you can remember it with the mnemonic IPS in UTI. So IPS officer in UTI, Union Territory of India. So I give you in the end a quick mnemonic to remember all these components of these 4 stages. So for sensory motor stages is the mnemonic is IPS in UTI, that is Union Territory of India. Let's discuss these stages one by one. First is the inborn motor and sensory reflexes. As the name suggests, the child is born with few organized reflexes such as sucking, palmar reflex, and these subsequently reflexes, they demonstrate 3 types of assimilations which the child has learned. One is reproductive, that means repeating the action, so the child will repeat these actions. Second is generalizing. Generalizing is repeating the actions even on new objects. And the third is recognitory, that means performing different actions on different objects. So basically these primitive reflexes, they demonstrate these 3 assimilations which the child has learned. Now second is primary circular reaction. Now, first of all, understand the meaning of circular reaction. Circular reaction basically means repeating of actions. Now, the first stage he described was from birth to 2 months. The second stage, which is primary circular reaction, he described is from 2 to 5 months. Now, basically here, the infant starts to repeat actions which they find satisfying. Now, before discussing this, first let's try to understand, because we'll also talk about what is secondary reaction, circular reaction, what is tertiary. So, primary circular reaction, these are basically centered on the child's own body. When we talk about secondary, these are centered on the external objects. Tertiary means that the child experiments with new ways to solve problem or reproduce interesting outcomes. So this is the meaning of primary, secondary, tertiary, which we will discuss. So let's talk about what is primary circular reaction. Here, basically it contains the first habits which develop out of the original schemata which already exist in the child, as they apply these schemata to objects in the environment or to the body. The child is not able to differentiate between the external environment and the body. So child is not able to differentiate between the means and the goals in this stage. So basically, they occur when by chance infant experiences a new consequence of a motor act, and subsequently the child tries to repeat those acts. So he's trying to experience movements and then they repeat. So this is primary circular reaction. We will repeat them even in different situations. Now then comes the third stage, which is secondary circular reaction. The duration is basically from 5 to 9 months. Now the initial distinction between means and ends become apparent to the child, although it is still in the primitive sense. So the infant repeats a particular action that achieved one end for the purpose of achieving other unrelated ends. For example, the child is pulling a string of a toy and it produces a bird sound. Now the child will also try to pull the string to get other sounds or something else with other toys. For example, another example, the child, moves a rattle and it produces a sound. Now the child will also apply this schema onto other toys. So the child will also try to move some other toys to produce some sounds. So this is what is secondary circular reaction. The child will repeat those actions. Next stages are use of familiar means to obtain ends, and tertiary circular reactions and discovery through active experimentation. Now, infants use a variety of means to obtain a particular goals. Now, the difference between stages 4 and 5 is the relative creativity or the newness of means or newness of ways to get their goals or ends done. So the difference is, in the stage 5, the child becomes even more creative. So let's talk about stage 4, which is use of familiar means to obtain ends. Now, it is basically marked by use of familiar means to basically obtain goals. So now the child is deliberately planning steps to get the desired object. Then comes tertiary circular reaction and discovery through active experimentation. This basically takes place from 1 year to around 18 months. Now, it is different from secondary circular reaction, as here the child no longer produces schemata that were effective in one situation to produce results in every situation. Here, what the child instead do is they explore environment and varies the means to test for effectiveness. So now they will learn newer methods to obtain the ends, to obtain the goals. For example, the child may use a stick and try to get a object or a toy which is placed, far from the child. So the child will try to learn newer and newer ways to get the work done or get the goals accomplished. So this is tertiary circular reaction. So basically, discovery is the hallmark of stage 5. It produces novel behavior. New behaviors are learned in this stage. Now let's talk about the last stage, which is insight and object permanence, which takes place around 18 months to 2 years. In fact, it is the stage of transition from the sensory motor period to the pre-operational sub-period. Now, what happens in this stage is that child becomes capable of inventing new means, not by direct actions on the object, but by mental combination. Now, for example, the child, sees other people, they manipulate the environment to get the goals done. For example, child sees the father, and father is opening a briefcase. He loses the briefcase by banging on the briefcase. So now the child has learned this and may apply this information while he's opening his toys, so he may just bang the toy to open the toy. So this is a newer means or ways the child is learning to get the goals done. So this is what is happening in insight and object permanence. So insight is a characteristic of this stage 6. Now, if we see during the sensory motor period, significant number of concepts they develop, including concept of space, time, causality, and they develop parallelly during these 6 stages. But one of the most important is the schema of object permanence. And in fact, it is one of the major accomplishments which occurs in this sensory motor period. So let's try to understand what is object permanence. Now, as the name suggests, it is the knowledge that objects in the external world have an existence independent of child's action on them or interaction with them. So a child can maintain the mental image of these objects even if they are not around him. So this is what is known as object permanence. So let's try to understand what does this mean. Now, suppose you show a spoon to a child in this sensory motor period and you drop the spoon in front of the child. So you are showing a spoon to the child and suddenly you drop it. It falls on the floor. Now, in stages 1 and 2, what happens is the child continues to look at the place where the spoon was last seen. So child will still look at your hand from where the spoon was dropped. In stage 3, it is seen that the child will look for it. Maybe just he will lean down to see or even look at the floor to see the spoon. Now let's see what happens in stage 4. Now suppose you have an object, you have the spoon and you hide it in your, you hide it somewhere behind your right hand. And now in front of the child only, now you hide it in another place. Let us say this is your left hand, that is position B. So what happens in this stage 4 is that if an object is repeatedly hidden at a point A and then point B, both in sight of the child will search it in point A and not B. So child will look at it at the initial position where you have hidden it. So this is what is happening in stage 4. Now what happens in stage 5 and 6? Here the child is able to follow multiple displacements of object through points in space even if the object is hidden in another object. Now suppose what you do is you take the spoon and you put it in various positions or in front of the child or even hide it in one of the toys. Now the child will look this object in that toy where you have hidden this. So this happens in stage 5 and 6. So basically what happens is that in the initial stage of sensory motor period, the child had this out of sight, out of mind thinking. That means if the object is not in front of the child or is not in sight, it does not exist. Or, here and now thinking, which gradually shifts or is replaced by schema of object permanence, which develops in stage 5 and 6. Basically, that means that object has a reality outside themselves, that even if the object is not in sight of the child still knows that object is still existing. So this is one very important accomplishment which occurs in sensory motor stage. Now let's talk about some of the other developments which take place. One is symbolization, which usually develops at 18 months. Here the child is able to create a mental image of a real object or an event. For example, if you tell the child a ball, or even though you don't show it. So the child is able to create that mental image in his mind of a ball. So this is symbolization which occurs. Then also the child shows signs of reasoning. For example, uses one toy to reach for another. So the reasoning also develops during this stage. And of course, we talked about object permanence. It marks precision. In fact, this is one important question which sometimes is asked. What marks the transition from sensory motor stage to the pre-operation stage? It is object permanence, a very, very important phenomenon which takes place during the stage. So this was about the sensory motor period.